Cheers, and welcome back to another episode of Puff Puff Pondercast. I'm your host, Emily, and I'm so glad that you're here. First, a happy Thanksgiving to everybody who celebrates. I hope your holiday was delicious and safe. I know I took a few extra moments myself for gratitude this year, one of which is for this podcast and for you. I really appreciate you tuning in and being a part of this journey, and it's been incredible to grow and learn how to make this space into something special. I can't wait to see where we go from here. We're gonna figure it out one page at a time. But for now, let's settle in and dive between the lines on chapters 11 through 15 of Dean Kuipers' Burning Rainbow Farm. Chapter 11 is a wild ride about Rainbow Farm's evolution into this countercultural hub and festival site. The chapter kicks off in Wisconsin in 1996 with Mo Yonkers, who we met last episode, and Amy heading to Weedstock, which was a marijuana festival notorious for its edgy vibe and, unfortunate, high arrest rates. But things don't go as planned. They're pulled over by a state trooper, and Amy gets busted for possessing 4 tiny seeds that she didn't even know were in her purse. And frustratedly, they miss Weedstock for the second year in a row. Now, when they get home, Tom, who is always full of big ideas, he picks them up and he announces his vision. We are going to have our own festival. And he's not talking about a backyard barbecue. He means a full-blown marijuana festival at Rainbow Farm. The plan is ambitious, with visions of live music and vendors, activism, and voter registration. To avoid legal trouble, Tom decides to host it on private property and focus on personal responsibility. The biggest risk would be getting to the event safely while carrying your bag of greens. Tom and Raleigh banned drug sales from occurring on their land to prevent any reason for the property to be at risk of civil forfeiture. Essentially, the goal is to create a festival where people can smoke weed without risking a felony. The chapter then dives into the planning and politics around Summerfest 96. Tom's strategy contrasts sharply with other marijuana activists like Ben Maisel, who preferred direct confrontation with law enforcement. Max fell more in line with Maisel's approach as well, and instead, Tom wants to keep things more peaceful and legal while making a statement, but not everyone is on board with this approach because Max pushed for the need of protection and tries to rope in the Michigan militia for security. Now, the militia's involvement is an interesting subplot because, from what I can tell, they seem to have been in the midst of their own agenda, which then turned into this joint effort. Now, at first, Tom rejects the idea of armed security. He's worried about it escalating tensions. And eventually, they settle on having the militia record potential police raids with video cameras instead of bringing in guns. And this compromise really highlights the intersection of these two seemingly unrelated movements at this time, which was the hemp activism and the militia's distrust in government overreach overall. The fact that both sides aligned and found a way to work beneficially for the other is a great example of how Tom himself has grown and shifted. Prior to Raleigh and this hemp movement, which seemed to simultaneously tame Tom's wild spirit and unleash this fierce force, I believe that Tom would have welcomed the gun militia in a proud-to-be-American type of protest. But instead we see him compromising to avoid conflict and minimize commotions that previously would have been what fueled his fight. Now, when Summerfest 96 finally happens, chaos ensues. Bands like Evening Rain and Strawberry Larry perform, but the lack of stage management and organization causes delays. And then there is the unforgettable arrival of the Pigfuckers, a rowdy group of locals who bring in a hogmobile and turn the festival into this drunken demolition derby. Their antics, which involved a mix of reckless driving, heavy metal music, and this keg-fueled nonsense, underscored the challenges of maintaining order in this countercultural space. And this seems to be typically the case when alcohol is brought in, yet we choose to keep cannabis illegal. Now, we also get to see some tense encounters with law enforcement, and at one point, a state trooper drives onto the property uninvited, only to be chased off by festival organizers and the militia, who are armed with the video cameras and spotlights. Now, this standoff becomes a defining moment, which reinforces Rainbow Farm's commitment to creating a thin green line of peaceful resistance. Tom stands his ground even as the trooper physically pushes him with her car, and he stood, hands firm on the hood, holding what ground he had, and he repeated himself, "This is private property and you do not have a warrant." He knew his rights, and he held to them tightly. Despite the chaos, Summerfest 96 is a huge learning experience, and the festival loses money and disappoints Max, but it highlights the need for just way better planning altogether. Now, it's also, though, a milestone, and it's proof of the concept of what Rainbow Farm could become. So by the end, Tom and his crew were already brainstorming ways to make the next festival even better. Now, going into Chapter 12, it dives into Rainbow Farm's Hemp Aid of 97. And this was a pivotal event that solidified its place into the countercultural history. The festival attracted around 3,000 people and featured high-profile speakers and activists who passionately defended cannabis as not just a plant, but as a cure for many. One of the main figures was Jack Herrera, who is the author of The Emperor Wears No Clothes. And that itself is a foundational text in the hemp movement. Now, Herrera's fiery speech was infused with personal anecdotes and a large dose of this revivalist fervor that was truly defining the spirit of the festival. He recounts his transformative LSD experience that let him realize marijuana's potential to save the world. And now, while his claims might sound unrealistic, he supported it with his historical and ecological arguments. Hemp was a vital resource for centuries, providing materials for paper, textiles, and even fuel. Henry Ford worked on a revolutionary vehicle called the Hemp Body Car that was a bioplastic Model T made of hemp, flax, and spruce pulp back in 1941, though it never went into production due to the onset of World War II. Companies that shared these industrial interests pushed for hemp's prohibition to clear the way for synthetic alternatives, and Herrera argued that these products had contributed to environmental destruction. His mantra, "Marijuana can save the world," became a rallying cry of that event. The festival, though, wasn't just centered on the protest. It had a lively, sort of idyllic vibe to it with vendors and live music, and these quirky traditions like the hippie slide, which was really just a mud-soaked slip and slide down a hill. Despite the fun, the event did have a serious purpose. Their aim was to increase voter registration, advocate for the medical marijuana petitions, and educate about the benefits of hemp and cannabis. Attendees ranged from devoted activists to just curious locals, and some just brought their families to walk around. It created a unique form of freedom in this small-town community affair. However, not everyone shared that peaceful vision, and the Michigan militia, which initially was involved for security, really brought in this underwave of tension, and some attendees were uneasy about their presence, but there were others that embraced their stance on individual rights. One speaker, Gatewood Galbraith, delivered a powerful populist speech railing against drug testing and the deterioration of civil liberties, calling attention to the government overreach. In his message, it tied marijuana legalization into the same fight of freedom and this resistance against oppression. Behind the scenes, though, these tensions also simmered as Scott Teeter, who was the prosecutor for Cass County, had become determined to crack down on Rainbow Farm. And while he initially held back on direct action, the growing visibility of the farm as a whole and these festivals, they really began to create a moral and political conflict. Now, at the same time, while that's going on, there are internal conflicts that are emerging between the organizers. Max and Tom clashed over the festival's direction and its finances. Max felt pushed to its side and accused Tom of prioritizing profit over the movement's goals. The fallout led to Max's departure, which led to a shift in Rainbow Farm. And by the end of the festival, Rainbow Farm had cemented its reputation as a dedicated space for marijuana activism and this alternative expression. But it also faced growing scrutiny from law enforcement and those internal challenges. Now, in the last episode, I shared my perspective on the term marijuana and why it's always felt derogatory to me when referring to cannabis. And today, I want to dig just a little deeper into that sentiment by exploring its history and connecting it to the activism and cultural resistance that's highlighted in Chapter 12. The term marijuana with an H came into mainstream views during the 1930s, largely due to Harry Anslinger, who was the first commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. Anslinger wasn't just enforcing drug laws, he was crafting these narratives. By deliberately adopting the term marijuana with an H, he leaned into this anti-Mexican sentiment of the time, associating the plant with Hispanic immigrants in an attempt to stoke fear and justify the prohibition. But this was not just about the plant. It was about vilifying a community and equating them and cannabis to a threat against American values. Anslinger's campaign planted the idea that cannabis wasn't just a drug, but it was something dangerous and foreign, something to be feared. And that linguistic shift has lasting effects. Even today, the term marijuana and marijuana with an H carry the weight of that discriminatory history. And personally, I find it validating to learn about this connection because it reinforces why these terms have felt so uncomfortable to me all along. I've seen the term with an H in the modern laws, yet never even knew the implications. Moving on to Chapter 13, it dives into the escalating battle between Rainbow Farm and the prosecutor, Scott Teeter, centering on the controversial use of using civil forfeiture as a weapon. And for Teeter, this approach was straightforward. He didn't even need to confront Tom or debate the broader politics of cannabis. Instead, one felony charge would suffice to initiate forfeiture proceedings, enabling the government to seize Rainbow Farm without the hassle of a courtroom showdown. This tactic was known as collars for dollars, and it had become a hallmark for law enforcement in the 1990s in Michigan, and it was often criticized for its misuse and devastating impact on property owners. The chapter opens with Teeter subtly flexing his authority by sending Tom a polite yet pointed letter in 1998. It cited these potential violations, claiming noise, littering, and drug use under the county's nuisance ordinance. And on the surface, it seemed minor, but the underlying message was clear. Teeter was watching, and he was not afraid to escalate. Tom, true to his character, did not take this lightly, and he drove to Cassopolis to confront Teeter and Sheriff Joe Underwood directly, but both refused to meet with him. So instead, Tom consulted his lawyer, Don France, and decided to ignore the letter, signifying his defiance. Teeter's strategy leaned heavily on scare tactics and these covert operations. He deployed undercover agents to the Rainbow Farm festivals, hoping to catch evidence of drug sales. However, despite the open cannabis use at these events, they found nothing substantial to prosecute. Teeter also set up roadblocks, which were infamously nicknamed Checkpoint Charlie, near the farm during the festivals. And these checkpoints really discouraged attendance because the attendees would risk arrest if caught with cannabis before reaching the property. And so this would hurt the festival turnout, but it still failed to yield the evidence that Teeter needed. Now, what loomed largest over this chapter was this role of civil forfeiture, and we've kind of talked about this before. It's the legal process that allowed law enforcement to seize property suspected of being connected to a crime. In Michigan, forfeiture laws were notoriously aggressive, with low standards of proof and a troubling reversal of the burden of innocence. Property could be taken on mere suspicion, leaving owners to fight costly legal battles to reclaim it. Even the so-called innocent owner clause provided little protection. Cases like Bennis v. Michigan in 1996 showed that co-owners could lose property due to another's misconduct as well. And for Teeter, this was the perfect tool. He didn't need to prove that Tom or Raleigh had committed a crime, just that Rainbow Farm was indirectly tied to illegal activity. The festival's popularity and the farm's countercultural reputation truly made it a prime target. Yet Rainbow Farm worked meticulously to avoid giving Teeter the ammunition that he needed. They enforced a strict no hard drugs policy, banned the on-site sale of drugs, and even destroyed substances that were found on the property. And these rules were posted all over on flyers, signs, and even on the farm's website, with staff monitoring the compliance. Now, despite these precautions, Teeter continued his pursuit, targeting festival vendors as a potential weak link. The vendors were required to share 10% of their proceeds with Rainbow Farm, and if any were caught selling drugs, Teeter could argue that the farm profited indirectly from the illegal activity. The chapter also highlights the broader implications of civil forfeiture. Nationally, this practice had become a billion-dollar industry by the mid-1990s, and it fueled a for-profit policing model. Many argued it encouraged corruption and disproportionately affected small-scale offenders and innocent parties. Cases like that of Donald Scott, which was a California landowner who was killed during a 1992 raid based on fabricated claims of cannabis cultivation, underscored the deadly risk that was tied to the forfeiture abuses. And for Rainbow Farm, this was a chilling reminder of the stakes involved. Now, finally, the chapter touches on the shadow of future legislation, like the 2002 Illicit Drug Anti-Proliferation Act, or the RAVE Act. Now, although not yet law during Rainbow Farm's battles, this act would later make it even easier to prosecute property owners for hosting events where drugs were used, which further tightened that noose around these alternative spaces like Rainbow Farm. Chapter 13 paints a vivid picture of the legal system that was weaponized to suppress activism and the alternative lifestyles. Teeter's campaign wasn't merely about upholding the law. It was about leveraging systemic loopholes to dismantle what Rainbow Farm stood for. And as the chapter closes, the tension is palpable, with Tom's defiance clashing against Teeter's relentless determination. The stage is being set for the dramatic and heartbreaking confrontation. Chapter 14 is titled A Blood Feud, and it captures a dramatic turning point for Rainbow Farm because it escalates the farm from this haven to a battleground for the war on drugs. The chapter opens up with preparations for Hemp Aid 99, which is shaping up to be Rainbow Farm's biggest event yet. The headliner? Tommy Chong, the comedic icon of stoner culture. And now alongside him, High Times magazine finally agreed to cover the event after years of hesitation. Rainbow Farm ramped up its efforts to promote the festival, and they plastered flyers across the Midwest and even into Canada. The stakes were sky high, both financially and symbolically, simply from a legal standpoint. This increased visibility also caught the attention of Teeter, who'd already begun monitoring the farm closely. And on March 24th of 1999, Teeter sent a certified letter warning Tom that any drug violation on Rainbow Farm could lead to civil forfeiture under the Michigan law. The letter came across as more than just a warning. It was a direct threat to take everything that Tom had built. I believe it was the letter that set the tone for how things were approached next, because Tom's response to Teeter's letter was fiery and defiant. And he wrote out a 2-page reply passionately defending Rainbow Farm as a peaceful place for assembly and free speech. He accused Teeter of overreach and drew historical comparison to the infamous government actions like Waco and Ruby Ridge. He'd even mentioned his friends in the Michigan militia as unarmed witnesses to any government action. The letter was bold, but it got easily misinterpreted because Teeter zeroed in on words like blood and militia, and he took them as a threat. From that point on, the dispute between Tom and Teeter took on the intensity of a personal vendetta. Now, in the lead up to Hemp Aid 99, Teeter tried multiple legal tactics to stop the festival. First, he claimed Rainbow Farm's nonprofit sponsor had lapsed in filing its paperwork, threatening their legal status. Tom's team scrambled to fix the issue, and the injunction was lifted. Next, Teeter targeted the farm's campground, arguing it wasn't properly licensed. This time, a quiet tip from the Cass County Health Department allowed Rainbow Farm to secure a temporary permit just in time. Teeter's plans to block the festival were thwarted, but it was clear that the battle was far from over. Now, despite the mounting pressure, Hemp Aid 99 went off as planned and became Rainbow Farm's most successful event to date. Nearly 5,000 attendees showed up, including activists, vendors, and bands. Tommy Chong's performance, complete with the classic stoner banter and a hail of joints that were tossed onto the stage, epitomized the festival's celebratory defiance. High Times covered the event and gave Rainbow Farm the national recognition that it had long sought. The atmosphere was electric, but the festival was also underscored by the growing strain on Tom and his team. So while the festival thrived, undercover officers from the Southwest Enforcement Team mingled in the crowd and documented drug sales. They bought marijuana, LSD, and other substances, but none of it could be directly tied to Tom, Raleigh, or the farm's contracted vendors. Still, Teeter used these observations to argue that the property itself was complicit in drug activity, which was laying the groundwork for future forfeiture attempts. Tom's strict no drugs policy became the key defense, but the growing presence of law enforcement signaled a long-term strategy to bring Rainbow Farm down. Managing the festival's growing popularity came with a lot of financial risk. Ticket sales brought in cash, sometimes in literal mountains, but it was a logistical challenge to handle such large sums securely. And so by Hempe 99, Rainbow Farm had transitioned to using Brinks trucks to use for cash pickups, which signaled both their success and the precarious balancing act of running such events under this constant scrutiny. Behind the scenes, Teeter worked at assembling this multi-agency task force that included the local law enforcement, the Michigan Attorney General's office, and even federal agents from the DEA and the FBI. Now, wrapping up this week's reading, Chapter 15 begins with Greg Schmidt, a constitutional lawyer from Saginaw, who is watching the results of the 1998 election roll in. Inspired by California's 1996 success with Proposition 215, which legalized medical marijuana, Schmidt decided to push the envelope further. Instead of focusing solely on medical marijuana, he envisioned a bold constitutional amendment to fully legalize cannabis. This initiative, called the Personal Responsibility Amendment, or PRA, went beyond California's efforts. The PRA proposed legalizing marijuana for personal use, reintroducing hemp as an industrial crop, eliminating small-time cannabis possession as a crime, and redirecting all asset forfeiture proceeds to drug treatment and domestic abuse centers. Schmidt sought funding from wealthy cannabis reform activists like George Soros, but was rejected because his amendment was seen as too radical. Undeterred, Schmidt became the first person in Michigan to post a ballot initiative online for signatures. The PRA was ambitious, but it resonated with Michigan's libertarian streak, and the high polling numbers were showing support for cannabis legalization. Rainbow Farm saw the PRA as a perfect articulation of its position. Tom and his crew embraced it wholeheartedly and viewed it as the pathway to the societal change that they'd long envisioned. Schmidt's pitch at Hempe 99 rallied the farm's community and transformed Rainbow Farm into the campaign's headquarters. However, the PRA faced an uphill battle. To qualify for the ballot, it required 302,711 valid signatures within 6 months. Though accounting for disqualifications, the real target was closer to 400,000. The effort was entirely volunteer-driven and had no paid staff or any substantial funding. The campaign was as grassroots as it gets. The volunteers would crisscross the state, collecting signatures at festivals, door-to-door, and during events like Hash Bash. Tom and Raleigh would help fund the activities, and supporters like Doug would personally front expenses for fundraisers. But these efforts would often operate at a substantial loss because the donations would rarely cover the costs. The campaign gave Rainbow Farm a renewed sense of purpose. It wasn't just about hosting festivals anymore. They were actively working to change laws and challenge the system. By the July 2000 deadline, the PRA had garnered 250,000 signatures, short of its goal, but still an impressive feat for a volunteer initiative. Encouraged by the response, Schmidt restarted the campaign in 2001. The second push gained momentum with NORML, which is the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, and the other organizations lended their support. However, even with the renewed efforts, the PRA ultimately fell short again, gaining only 288,000 signatures. The PRA made Rainbow Farm fuel in political controversy. Tom's outspoken support for the amendment and his broader advocacy for personal freedoms positioned him as a credible voice in the community. The popularity combined with the PRA's momentum heightened tensions with county officials and law enforcement. Teeter and law enforcement saw Rainbow Farm not just as a nuisance, but as a genuine threat to their anti-drug agenda. Now, while the amendment wasn't the sole cause between the feud with Tom and Teeter, it certainly contributed. The personal responsibility amendment's near success, despite its limited resources, demonstrated the growing support for cannabis reform in Michigan, and it cemented Rainbow Farm's legacy as a catalyst for this change. Now, this brings us to something that I've been really reflecting on. So before we wrap up this week, let's take a moment to zoom in on how deeply this book is layered. Now, from the political struggles to the social movements, it is packed with important figures, places, and concepts that often make me stop and think. Honestly, though, these moments of exploration, or like these little rabbit hole dives, have really become one of my favorite parts of this process. So let's take chapter 12, for example. It's titled The Pantagruel of All Time, or Marijuana Can Save the World. Before I even began the chapter, I had to stop and ask myself, what does Pantagruel mean? And it felt like one of those references that could completely shift how I understood the chapter. And it absolutely did. At first glance, I thought it might be a juxtaposition, something like the detriment of all time versus marijuana as a lifesaver. So I did some digging. Pantagruel, as it turns out, is this fascinating character from the Renaissance novel Gargantua and Pantagruel by Francois Rabelais. He's a literal giant known for his immense appetite, but not just for food. He has a hunger for knowledge, truth, and adventure as well. He's witty, philosophical, and he embodies this idea of abundance in every way possible. What's interesting is how this chapter uses Pantagruel as a metaphor for cannabis. The title suggests cannabis as a similar force of nature, something abundant and transformative that's filled with the ability to heal, connect, and even elevate our understanding of the world. It reminded me of how often cannabis is described as this abundant plant medicine. And it's not just about physical healing, but also mental and spiritual well-being. Viewing cannabis through Pantagruel's lens gave a fresh perspective on its role in the story and on that chapter's broader themes. But this is the thing, it's not the only moment that has made me stop and think. This book is packed with references, different names, places, and ideas that just hold so much more meaning when you take the time to sit down and explore them. So I'm going to just post a few more of the terms that I've looked up on screen so that you can see as well, and maybe some of these will resonate with you as well, or even inspire you to dig a little bit deeper. And don't worry if you feel like you don't always get everything right away. Part of what makes reading such an incredible journey is that it's okay to not know everything up front. We're all learning as we go, and that curiosity is what makes this so rewarding. Now, looking ahead, we're going to be finishing Burning Rainbow Farm in the next episode, diving into these final chapters together. And I just can't wait to share my thoughts and to hear yours. So be sure to join me right back here on YouTube on Saturday, December 14th for the premiere. And if you haven't already, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so that you don't miss out. I'd love for you to join the conversation over on Instagram and X at PuffPuffPondercast as well. So let's keep exploring and let's keep learning together. Remember, lit minds lead lit lives. Till next time.